Welcome to Research Methods.
This will be Chapter 2, Research Methods.
This will
My daughter thought it very important for me to let you all know that she knew that this was Chapter 2, Research Methods. Without further ado, welcome to Chapter 2, Research Methods. Today we are going to just cover how psychologists, specifically social psychologists, do experiments. This is going to, again, be a pretty short lecture because if you've taken any other any other psychology classes, you kind of know what we're talking about. So to briefly talk about the scientific method, right, this is something we've seen since third grade. So the scientific method, right, is the idea that we have questions. Why do people do the things they do? So we make hypotheses. People do the things they do because it is a combination of their personality and behavior. We test those hypotheses, which lead to research analyses. We can make theories out of this data and keep this cycle going. Again, this is nothing I think that is too special for anybody in a college class. So when it comes to how do we as psychologists study people, well, one thing we can do is we can describe behavior through naturalistic observation. So we can just observe behaviors as they happen. You can go sit down in a coffee shop and see how people act. But then it becomes a question of, is it just you sitting there watching, or are you going to participate? A very famous psychology experiment in social psychology by Leon Festinger involved joining a cult. Dr. Festinger actually went into a group of individuals who believed that the world was going to end on December 21st, 1956. He joined this cult a few weeks earlier, and he wanted to see what happens, as the book title says, when prophecy fails, when this prophecy doesn't come true. And he found that the people who were really, really into the cult, they didn't just say, oh, I've been lied to. What did they do? They said, I must have prayed so hard that the world didn't end. This is a really interesting thing. This is the idea of cognitive dissonance, but we'll talk about that later. Doing an experiment like this gives us some really interesting data. We get to see what people do in the outside world. It's a realistic setting, but there's a lot of problems with this, as mentioned. Right? We can't show cause as to why things happen this way. Beyond that, we can also talk about survey research. So surveys or questionnaires, this is the bread and butter of social psychological research. This is the majority of my research is based on surveys. And the beauty of surveys is you get a lot of information really quick, really fast, using these Likert type scales from strongly disagree to strongly agree. But there are some limits to this, right? How are you wording questions, right? If I asked you a question like, are you a good person? Versus, do you do bad things? The way that you answer those questions might be different. You might respond in a way that makes you feel desirable, right? Are you a good person? People feel kind of innately like they need to answer yes to that. We can also talk about where you're getting your sample from. Not everybody who you send out a survey to will take it. So are there specific issues with the group of people who are taking your surveys? So while we can describe behavior, something we're more interested in doing is being able to predict behavior. And one way that we can predict behavior is through correlational studies. Right? So correlational studies are great because they allow us to see if there are relationships between two variables, but usually variables we can't manipulate. I can't manipulate how much money you make a year, not ethically at least. I can't manipulate whether you are male or female, or a Republican or Democrat. So you can see, though, if being a Republican or Democrat, male or female, being a high income earner or low income earner relates to something else. So this is great because you can get lots of data pretty cheap as well, but there are issues again with response bias and things like sampling errors. So the idea that, as I mentioned on that last slide, there's a picture of this guy, Kinsey, and Kinsey, he studied the sex habits of Americans in the 50s during a really taboo time. And one thing he found was that about 25% of married men cheated on their spouses. which is strange because that's not really true. He happened to only be sampling from jails where he was doing his interviews. So, right, 25% of married men in jail were cheating on their spouse. So, right, recognizing your sample is a thing that matters. Lastly, I put up on this slide that you can't interpret causality. You've probably heard that correlation doesn't equal causation, the idea that just because two variables are related, one doesn't make the other one happen. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail later. But when we talk about correlations, we talk about these as either positive correlations, how when one variable increases, the other variable increases. The amount of minutes you spend studying for this exam will positively correlate, right? Will go up with the number of points you get on this exam. The more you study, the better you'll do. You can have a negative correlation. As one variable goes up, the other one goes down. So as the you can imagine as the minutes of exercise goes up for you, maybe the amount of weight, right, the amount you weigh goes down. More you exercise, right, the less you weigh, assuming that you're taking into account food, right? That's another portion. And then there are correlations that are zero. They have no predictive value. I can't use the temperature to determine how tall or, how happy I'm going to be today. That's not really a good predictor of how I'm going to feel. So beyond that, we can talk about this idea that correlation doesn't equal causation, that you can't definitively assume causation from these correlational research. There could be a third variable, right? We always hear that shoe size is related to reading level. Is it really that shoe size is related to reading level? Or is it the case that there's a different third variable? The idea that maybe it's not shoe size and reading level, but it's the age of a child. So as my daughter gets older, she's going to be able to read better. As she gets older, her shoes are also going to get bigger. It's not the case that if you have a size 15 men's foot, that you're going to be the best reader in the world. So kind of continuing on this, in class, I usually use these two examples, right? That there's a positive correlation between coffee and the probability of heart attack, and the correlation between ice cream sales and homicide rates. So these are both positive correlations that have been found. Strange. Is it the case where the more you drink coffee, the more likely you are to get a heart attack? Well, not really. It's actually another variable, age. Kind of similar to the last example, funny enough, but this idea that older people tend to drink more coffee and older people are more likely to have a heart attack. So that might be why these are related. And in terms of ice cream sales and homicide rates, why could that be linked? Well, when are people outside and dealing with one another? People don't tend to go get ice cream when it is really cold outside, at least as much as they do in the summer. So this is an example where heat is also related to that. And that's actually a factor in aggression, something we'll talk about in the chapter on aggression. So it's important to know, though, that you can never directly assume causation because, right, it might be reversed to what you think. Is it the case that marriage leads to happiness? Or is it the case that happiness makes you more likely to get married? So knowing which direction this goes is very important. And then reciprocal causation, this idea that it might not just be that one is affecting the other, but they're affecting each other together. This idea that helping people might increase happiness, but maybe being happy as well also makes you more likely to help, furthering the cycle of being a helpful person here, right? In its kind of feedback loop. So you can imagine that there's other reasons you can't necessarily say, oh, this is causal. However, it is important to know that this can be a very useful effect. We don't necessarily know that smoking causes cancer because we don't give some people cigarettes and some people not, and then see if they get cancer. But, right, it helps us to see things, just in the same way that you might still be able to tell what animal this is under the sheet. It's a giraffe. Anyways, the next thing we're going to talk about is explaining behavior. What we're really trying to get to is understanding why people do the things they do and know with good authority that this is the reason they do it. So this is experiments. The strength of experiments is that they're very high in internal validity. We know all of the things that are going into this. We know what type of people are coming in. We know what type of variables are using to affect these people. And we can deduce some causality that because of all of this, this causes this. That in this example here, that authority figures will cause people to follow them. This is the Milgram experiment. However, it's very difficult to run experiments, and they're low in external validity. They're not like a observational study where you can see what people are doing in their natural quote unquote habitat. So there are these issues with demand characteristics. But when it comes to talking about variables and experiments, right, we go back to independent and dependent variables. So, right, in a simple study in social psychology, you might want to test if acting aggressively makes you more or less angry. And to do this, you would look at your independent variable of, right, what you are talking about with aggression, acting aggressively. So you might have an experimental group which causes people to act aggressively, throw a chair at their boss after their boss yells at them, versus a control group, which might say something along the lines of, when your boss yells at you, just sit angrily in your chair for a couple minutes. So compare that to the dependent variable, right, where we're measuring the consequences. That would be this measure of how you feel after your boss yells at you and you act either aggressively or not. So you can think about the independent variable as the one that we are manipulating, and the dependent variable as the one we are measuring and seeing how it's dependent on the other variable. So when I think about variables, right, you could imagine running a study where you want to see how something grows. You could imagine thinking about how a plant grows or a baby. But the variables that help these two things grow, sunlight, water, soil quality, whether or not my dog, digs it up, is a little different than the variables that might help my daughter grow. I don't think I should give her sunlight, water, soil. That's probably not the best idea. Also, got to make sure my dog is okay around her still, though, right? But the idea that our independent variable and dependent variable might be different we might be measuring something different, even if it's talking about the same concept. And this is the idea of an operational definition. So an operational definition is the idea of how are you defining your concept? And in a lot of other sciences, this isn't a difficult thing. How far away is something? We measure it in feet, inches, meters, whatever it might be. You want to measure how hot something is, you use a thermometer. But when it comes to measuring how aggressive somebody is, there's no thermometer of aggression, or I can't get a ruler to measure how aggressive you are. So an operational definition is, in psychology, some kind of clear and concise way that we can all agree on and see that we can measure something. So we think this is all easy, but if I asked you to operationally define a sandwich, right, you might say something like, well, it is a piece of bread with something in between it. Well, that just means I could give you 3 pieces of bread and that's a sandwich. I don't think that's a very good one. And if you said it's something, 2 pieces of bread with something in between it, is a hot dog a sandwich? No, right? And if it's 2 pieces of bread with something between it, is this guy a sandwich? Makes you question some things. So the idea is that even asking you to define what a sandwich is, something that we all know, can be a little tricky. So imagine how we have to define happiness or love, as we'll talk about later. So to kind of finish up here today, we're going to talk about using sound research methods. And so while we are, predicting, explaining, describing behavior, we have to make sure that, especially in experiments when we are trying to describe behavior, that we are using good sound methods. And that includes using controls, making sure some variables are held constant while others are manipulated. Making sure we randomly sample, take a random, you are randomly selected from a group of people to take part in this experiment. And then when you are randomly selected from that group, You are then randomly assigned, chosen to be in either the control group or the experimental group. And not only that, there's this idea of how we know how our measures are. Are our measures reliable and are they valid? So, are our measures reliably measuring what we think they're measuring? So, if we think that we are measuring happiness, is it the case that it is going to measure, me being happy when I'm happy and me being sad when I'm sad? And then validity. Is it measuring the same concept I want it to? If I am measuring depression, I don't think I should just ask, how are you feeling today? Because that might be helpful to understand depression, but maybe there's a couple better questions. Not just how are you feeling, but have you been feeling down in the dumps lately? Things like that. When it comes to reliability, I like to think about consistency. You want a friend who is reliable and consistent. If you step on a scale, you want it to measure the same weight each time. You don't want it to be 10 pounds different each time you step on the scale. Otherwise, that's not a very reliable scale. Compare that to validity. And we talk about two types of validity. Can we trust these findings in the extent of internal validity? So is it the case that when we look at this, are our measurements, are our questions, are our variables the ones that are affecting this? And external validity or generalizability. Does this go not just to the group of people that we're studying, but does this finding generalize to everybody in the world? Lastly, there's this idea of construct validity. So are we accurately measuring our variable of interest? So are IQ tests a good measure of intelligence? Not really. But I always like to talk about this idea of measuring something complex like love. How would you measure love? Well, let's think about this. So, construct validity is the idea that we are wondering how well we're measuring our variable of interest. So, our variable here, love, right? How are we measuring love? Well, love, when we measure it, gives us some outcomes related to love, right? So, we know that things related to being in love include kind of being happy, having an increased amount of oxytocin, etc. But when we measure things like love, we also might be, so also well-being, happiness, lower stress. But when we measure love, we might also be getting unrelated things, right? When we measure love, we might also be getting some information about how long these relationships lasted, which isn't necessarily something that is an important aspect of this. So, right, when you measure love, there's a lot of different ways you can measure love, right? Is love like in the Notebook? Is love just sharing coupons because you know it's cheaper for one another? Is love what we saw in Titanic? Absolutely not. And I totally disagree with this. I hate this. But what we will talk about towards the end of class, or in the middle of class, I should say, is how we measure love. And one way we can measure love is through three types of love, right? This idea of liking, this idea of being passionate, and this idea of commitment towards one another. And so, right, if we wanted to measure love, we might ask different types of questions related to intimacy, related to passion, and related to commitment to help us to better make sure we cover the construct of love. So that, again, is a very quick overview of everything I wanted to cover for this lecture. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I hope you're all doing well. Have a great day. Bye-bye.